I really want to ask this very important question, why you wrote this book called Dopamine Nation.
I was trying to communicate the message that we live in a drugified world where almost every aspect of human behavior and consumption has been made more reinforcing, more novel, more accessible, more bountiful, such that we've all become vulnerable to the problem of addiction. And that means that we've also become more vulnerable to the problem of anxiety, depression, inattention, insomnia, etc. Because, of course, addiction is the great mimic, and the downstream effect of addictive compulsive overconsumption of any drug, and I use the term drug very broadly here to encompass behaviors as well as food, ultra-processed food in particular, the downstream effect is mental health sequelae.
And we've seen that, just sharing offline with you, that 50% of corporate Johannesburg is on an antidepressant. And I'm not anti-Western medicine. I've been a physician for 25 years. I've seen over 140,000 consults in the practice. But there's got to be different ways that we address this mental ill health epidemic, in my view, and just mental performance that is plummeting at such a rapid rate. And that's why we're going to be doing a series with a few psychiatrists, some of your own colleagues overseas in the US and some colleagues here in South Africa. But let's talk about my own addiction. I don't like to use the word I am an addict to have identity with that, although I've learned a lot from internal family systems. I think that's been a breakthrough for me in the last year, because we have so many different parts of us. But, I'm really addicted to researching and lecture to over 12,000 medical professionals worldwide. And, I've read 31 books in the last 12 months. And every single minute, if I'm in the car and I got a 3-minute trip, I'll spend 2 minutes to try and find a podcast to listen to so that I get that information. And so I'm really addicted to learning. And this is my go-to. And then when I get the learning and the insights to share it, I get this massive dopamine hit. So I've got my own story there. Is everyone addicted to something in this really overstimulated, there's too much indulgence world that we have?
Great question. Addiction, broadly defined, is the continued compulsive use of a substance or a behavior despite harm to self and or others. In general, when we think about learning, although it does cause the release of dopamine in the brain's reward pathway, which is why it feels good to many people, we haven't traditionally thought of that as something that's addictive. We think of that as healthy, as adaptive, as strengthening us in so many ways. When I use the word addiction, I am specifically speaking to a form of psychopathology. So without knowing you better, it would be really hard for me to say whether or not I would use the term addiction in your case as just described to me now. Not necessarily. It sounds like it could just be a passion or something you're really invested in, but perhaps given more time to discuss it in depth, I would come to know that your obsession with learning and communicating that knowledge is impacting your personal relationships, is impacting your self-care, is in other ways interfering with you having, the kind of life that you want and need to be a thriving human. So I want to put it out there. I also want to say that what's amazing about the time that we live in now is that even what we typically and traditionally have thought of as healthy and adaptive behaviors like making human connection, learning, doing work that contributes to the world, even those very good and healthy things have become drugified. How? They've been made more potent by being social media or connecting them to social media, hence connecting them to the potential for dollars and fame. They become more accessible. So work, for example, has no limit, has no end. We can access it 24/7 wherever we are. Information overload. It's, again, become more novel. You learn one thing and immediately you want to learn another thing, and you can access it right away. So it's an acceleration of that learning process without any pauses that are so necessary for us to kind of reset the reward, get back to kind of baseline levels as we think of this baseline dopamine levels. So it's important to acknowledge that even healthy stuff has become unhealthy in the modern ecosystem.
So it's not actually the actual object, or, Netflix or exercise or learning or food. It's the abuse of that behavior or that object or that situation that then causes
Well,
imbalance.
it is the object. So the point is that all of these objects have been turned into drugs, right? We have bioengineered them through the technology and through our supply chain and many other factors to be more accessible, more potent, more novel, and more bountiful. I mean, think about TikTok. TikTok literally never runs out. If you had a world in which cocaine literally never ran out, we would have a much bigger cocaine problem than we do. And we already have a big cocaine problem.
But Dr. Anna, is it not the dose then that's important? Because if you're on, say, Instagram or social media, we'll talk about that at the end, but you use it to a far lesser degree that doesn't impact areas or doesn't reset your dopamine balance, then it's not causing any sort of problem with your dopamine reset.
Right. So what we can infer based on animal models and clinical experience is that if you use intoxicants in moderation and leave enough time in between use to reset those reward pathways, you are less likely to develop that addiction phenotype. And there are also interesting animal studies showing, for example, if you expose a rat to a lever to press a lever to get intravenous cocaine, and you expose them to that lever press for 1 hour a day, what you find is that over successive days, they have the same rate of lever press. So there's not an increase in the rate over successive days. But if you expose them to cocaine for 6 hours a day, which is essentially all day long, what you find is that over consecutive days, they press the lever faster and faster and faster, ultimately till exhaustion or death. So we are dealing with something, at least when it comes to a stimulant like cocaine, where hypothetically, if there's enough time in between, maybe it's possible to use something like cocaine in moderation. I am not espousing or endorsing to anybody out there to use cocaine in any amount. My point is just that the neuroscience really speaks to all of these rewarding substances and behaviors working on the same common pathway. Whatever the chemical cascade is, the final common pathway is to release dopamine in that reward pathway. The more dopamine that's released, the more reinforcing that substance or behavior is for a given individual. And then most importantly, what starts out as being salient or releasing a lot of dopamine for that individual with repeated exposure ultimately releases less and less dopamine and causes a dopamine deficit state where now what we have is what George Koob calls dysphoria-driven relapse. The main driver of our compulsive overuse is not to feel pleasure or solve the problem that we initially set out to solve, but really just to get out of this dopamine hole and feel normal.